I mean, are we just like bored, spoiled children who've just been lying in the bathtub all day, just playing with their plastic duck, and now they're just thinking, well, what can I do?
Here's what you need to understand before we begin this video. I'm Dionysus, and you are the central character of a tragedy from which there is no escape. The only way to find out who you are in this story is to watch, like, and subscribe. If you can accept that, you're about to have a wonderful time. If not, you're in for 15 minutes of staring at a screen, even if you watch something else. I'm Dionysus, and you're watching Melissa Explains the Classics. Liber Pater, Bacchus, Dionysus, the ancient Greek god of wine, madness, and theater. A deity who pops up when people want to release their inhibitions, who compels them to release their inner cringe. Like this tourist in Italy, recently caught simulating sex acts on a statue of Dionysus. And who can blame her? Good listener, hard as a rock, and unlike most Italian guys, won't raise a hand against her. Mamma mia! Today, Dionysus is an icon for Reddit pagans, Etsy Wiccans, and other escapist subcultures of the chronically unsexy and mediocre. Historically, however, his divinity was at its most captivating 2,000 years ago as the ancient Greek god of tragic theater. And of the literature available to us, it was the Athenian tragedian Euripides who wrote the most thought-provoking story on Dionysus ever written, the Bacchae. A story so seductive, so horrifying, yet so confusing. It'll feel like losing your virginity to what you think is your high school crush, but what actually turns out to be the school lunch lady. And you're both naked and writhing around a disease-ridden ball pit of a Chuck E. Cheese while some creep in a goat costume prances around you playing Nirvana's In Utero album on the flute. Although the play's relevance began to fade with the rise of Christianity, scholarly and cultural interest in the story was resurrected in 1872 with Nietzsche's publication of Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. A vibrant century of Dionysian-themed cultural and artistic expression bloomed after its publication, mostly consisting of a lot of pining for mountains and shepherds, stemming from a yearning to escape progress and capitalism. So it's like hippies, but with enough of a sense of shame to shower and not start a drum circle.
Faster, man! More annoying!
It was a period which began with a drunken orgy of national pride, celebration of nature, and boundless imagination, and ended with one hell of a hangover in the form of mass hysteria, tyranny, and genocide. All of which eerily echoes the story of power, divine ecstasy, madness, and murder that Dionysus inflicts on the people of Thebes in the Bacchae. Coincidence? Or is the Bacchae the dark reflection perceived by one man of a civilization that's eerily similar to our own, which shows us that humanity is and always has been a bunch of Manchurian candidates of chaos, manipulated by psychosocial forces beyond our understanding or control. Jordan Peterson would say, "Yeah, we're in trouble, man. What the leftist identitarians don't understand is Dionysus is the god of chaos, and he's always there, watching, waiting for the opportunity to compel you to stick your finger in your belly button and then sniff it because you think no one's looking, but they are." Maybe we can find the answer through a closer look at what's considered one of the best plays written of all time, and by getting to know one of the most powerful gods in human history. Ladies and gentlemen, he's called the Night Walker, the Wild One, the Lover of Laughter, the Joker, the Smoker, the Midnight Toker. Whatever the nickname, calling him a myth won't protect you. So prepare yourselves for the roaring voice of the God of Joy.
Who am I? Why am I here? Where do I come from? And where am I going?
4th century Roman official Saturninus Secundus Sallustius once defined myth as something that never happened but always is. And to the ancient Greeks, it must have seemed like Dionysus had always been, having predated their civilization by some 2,000 years. Worship of Dionysus goes all the way back to the Bronze Age, already connected to fermenting fruit and grains into wine and mead as an allegory for the god's own story of death and rebirth, the core of all Dionysian myth. Like if Jesus realized he loved getting crucified, and every time he resurrected, he ran right back to the cross to do it again, like a kid getting back in line for the slip and slide. He's known as the crusher of men, one who ferments greatness like a bunch of grapes, squishing and breaking you down so that you can be transformed into a divine elixir, adored by sexually frustrated housewives across ancient suburbia. It's this uncanny aesthetic of life born out of death and flourishing from destruction that gives Dionysus that certain je ne sais goth that the Greeks knew and loved. Like his other strange symbolism, a mask nailed to a tree, snakes, vines, the ritual dithyramb melody that sounds like a bardcore cover of a Tool song, horny satires, and a zombie baby in a basket with a huge man boner, Dionysus evokes the feeling of everything that makes the world weird. His religious followers were mainly women, called Maenads or Bacchantes, compelled to roam through the wilderness in a frenzy of joy and ecstasy, ripping apart any man, bra, or animal that got in their way, drinking their victims' blood, and throwing the torn limbs and guts into the trees. This is why the Dionysian is often seen as a reflection of feminine psychology. Its darkness, its chaos, its cringe wolf girl memes, and free-bleeding crystal dance circles. Back in the day, it wasn't bitches be crazy. It was bitches be crazy!
Allow ourselves safe spaces to release this fiery, hot emotion from within us so that it can no longer poison or toxify our internal emotion.
The Manson family is probably the best modern example of the Dionysian archetype. Women driven to madness and ritual murder by some silver-tongued twink. Which means that Charles Manson, who never actually killed anyone himself, was basically imprisoned for practicing Dionysus without a license. Murder and dismemberment aside, however, Dionysus is popularly considered the god of the good time, of spiritual liberation from rules and reality, and the mysterious fertility of imagination and creativity. But as Euripides would point out in the Bacchae, behind those smooth, flushed cheeks and smiling, wine-stained lips loomed the shadow of a menacing, horned figure who, just like wine, could intoxicate with ego-dissolving joy and ecstasy, but also madness, violence, and the urge to kill. Or at least do something really unpleasant, like swap out your apple juice for pee-pee.
Giving yourself over to the unconscious can leave you vulnerable to all sorts of very frightening manipulation.
Athenian tragedian Euripides was born on the island of Salamis in 480 BC, during a period of Greek history defined by Hellenic city-states banding together to fight the Persian Empire's invading armies, then immediately turning around to fight each other. Like a toxic Greek couple from Queens telling their local Persian deli guy to mind his own business before turning around to resume their kebab skewer sword fight. Known as the most tragic of tragic poets, Euripides was an expert at getting an audience to experience pathos, the money shot of ancient Greek tragedy, which was a feeling of pity or fear induced by the fate of the play's main characters. When it comes to Greek tragedy, the show ain't over till the fat lady sings, "Oh gods, I'm gonna pathos!" The Bacchae was performed a year after Euripides' death in 407 BC for one of the grandest pagan holidays in ancient Greek culture. Equal parts theater competition and religious ritual, the City Dionysia was an important holiday celebrating Dionysus, which included, among other things, animal sacrifice, sacred theater masks, plays about mythological heroes, and parades of drunk pagans waving around bread and pictures of penises. Like a pride parade of dancing around sniffing poppers and wearing a fox-tailed butt plug could save us from the wrath of God.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul and seal your doom tonight.
Speaking of the gays, the main event of the City Dionysia was its theater competition. Why theater? There are some theories. One that I find personally compelling is that because of his connection to ritual madness and imagination, Dionysus was essentially the personification of illusion. Because plays have the power to magically transform actors into heroes and gods and transport audiences to faraway lands, ancient Greek theater essentially functions like one mass Dionysus conjuring ritual. So when you watch social media influencers, TV shows, or this video, the illusion of drama, coolness, or beauty being portrayed is actually you seeing the face of Dionysus. To quote the psychologist Jeanette Paris, who's slowly being swallowed alive by a giant scarf, Dionysus is not the god behind the mask, he is the mask. And Euripides invoked this concept of illusion at the City Dionysia as the backdrop to a play that moved away from boosting patriotic morale and held a mirror up to the audience in ways that were penetrating and subversive.
My impulse when Pentheus has been killed by his mother in the Furies. No, I wanted Agawe to bring on a real head, and that this head should be passed around the audience so that somehow people realize that this stuff was real.
At the Bacchae start, Dionysus stands before the audience and highlights the play's central conflict, the invasion of Greece by an Asian religion. Not K-pop, although Bacchantes and Koreans do share a strange obsession with androgynous teen idols. Dionysus has just arrived in Thebes from the mysterious Orient, disguised as a priest and leading a pack of raving Bacchantes, the god's sacred groupies on an eternal tour with the divine manifestation of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. He poses dramatically in front of the city and goes into a long expository dialogue about his origin story. Years ago, his mother Semele, while pregnant with Dionysus, had been killed by Zeus's jealous wife Hera upon discovering that Zeus was the father. Disguised as a little old lady giving unsolicited advice to Semele, Hera convinces Semele that if Zeus really loved her, he'd show her his true god form. So Semele tricks Zeus into showing her who he really is. Unfortunately for Semele, Zeus's true form is lightning, and Semele's true form turns out to be combustible. After accidentally incinerating his side piece, Zeus takes the still gestating Dionysus from the top of the ash pile and hides it from his wife by shoving the fetus into his thigh. Like a joyriding teenager trying to eat all the drugs in the car before the cop that pulled him over makes it to the driver's side window. What seems to be the problem, Officer Hera? He's born a second time out of a leg vagina, and Zeus crowns him with snakes like a prom king from hell. In the aftermath of Semele's surprise cremation, her sisters reject their nephew Dionysus and deny that he's the son of Zeus, exiling him from the city. An oddly confident claim to make, seeing as how 80% of all the interactions between people and gods in ancient Greek myth consist of Zeus inside of somebody. Years go by, and Dionysus's cousin Pentheus has taken over their grandfather Cadmos' seat as the ruler of Thebes, and has also outlawed all Dionysian worship from the city. The rest of the Bacchae recounts the myth of Dionysus returning to and introducing his religion to the ancient Greeks and seeking vengeance for his mother's death. He does this by first driving all the women in the city, including his aunts, into a Bacchic frenzy, sinking their periods, hiding all the chocolate, playing Taylor Swift songs on repeat, making their bras too tight, all to provoke hysteria and send them screaming into the mountains. Pentheus immediately responds by trying to arrest them all, against the advice of basically everybody, including the Theban prophet Tiresias, who warns Pentheus that it's futile to fight women who are under the protection of such an obviously powerful god. Take my advice, Pentheus. When it comes to women, if you can't beat them, well then you're all out of ideas, aren't you? Instead of listening to Tiresias, you fool! Dionysus's well-meaning yet kind of tight-ass cousin Pentheus keeps attempting to arrest the god of joy and have him executed, which results in a Bugs Bunny-like scenario between the god of joy and his Elmer Fudd of a cousin. In the end, Pentheus falls under his cousin's spell and gets paraded through Thebes in a dress before being lured into the woods and dismembered alive by a squad of Maenads led by his own mother and her sisters. Through this symbolic conflict between Dionysus and Pentheus, Euripides was touching on themes such as chaos versus order, religion versus state power, and the danger of each at their extremes. The Bacchae won first place that year at the City Dionysia and went on to become one of the most studied plays of the ancient world. But with the rise of Christianity, Dionysus lost the competition for tragic androgynous sex symbol to Jesus for the next millennium, and the Bacchae eventually came to be considered too gruesome for civilized people to read. It was almost the end of the road for one of the most ancient divinities in human history, and for one of the best plays ever written, until Nietzsche published Birth of Tragedy in 1872, which breathed new life into the study of antiquity, but may have also influenced one of the biggest atrocities of the 20th century.
Now, you can easily see the line between something like this and something like Hitler's Nuremberg rallies is in a way a very thin line.
In Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche argues that the biggest existential risk facing humanity is one day reaching the limits of our ability to make new discoveries about the underlying truth of existence. In other words, what if we find out that our best truth-seeking tools, like science, aren't able to continue to move us towards an understanding of the universe and why we're here? Like being trapped in an escape room but with the IQ of a Shih Tzu. Faced with an enigmatic universe that could never be fully understood would result in a society trapped in nihilism, the belief that life has no essential meaning or value. Nihilism. Great for intellectual conversation and art, not so great for having a reason to not do heroin. Nietzsche proposed that the antidote to nihilism is turning to pre-scientific ancestral rituals like Dionysian worship through Greek tragedy. It was perfect in that it checked off all the boxes that Nietzsche was looking for. A communal ritual that releases people from the confines of their individuality and lets them be part of a universal whole. B, archetypes of superhuman heroes with whom people could identify. And C, an excuse to dress up in drag and be a pretty princess. Like a comic book convention without the furries. Unless you count the chorus of satires, in which case, with furries. New York Comic-Con, baby! Woo! This is why Nietzsche hated Euripides' version of the Bacchae. He felt that the playwright's style was too self-aware, too cynical, and gave superficial solutions to deeper problems. Basically like the 5th century version of the show Friends. or Full House, or Family Matters. Euripides, as far as Nietzsche was concerned, had destroyed everything about the spiritual ritual of tragic theater that could unleash humanity's potential for greatness. However, maybe Nietzsche would have changed his mind about the Bacchae if he had thought to ask himself one question. What kind of people would benefit from being able to trigger mass psychosis in large groups of nihilists at will? The Nazis, for one, who used a twisted version of Nietzsche's ideas as a guiding philosophy in the lead-up to World War II. In fact, shortly after Birth of Tragedy was published, critics were already pointing out how its rhetoric seemed to echo those of the nationalist movements gaining power in Germany and around the world. Decades later, 20th century philosopher Erich Hofer observed in his book True Believer that instigators of revolutionary violence often use people's struggle to escape their personal failures and disillusionment with their society to convince him or her of the necessity to destroy or dismantle it. Finally, in 1972, Stanford professor René Girard gave insight in his book Violence and the Sacred about how Dionysian cult worship was part of an ancient human mechanism that used religious ritual to justify murder as a social tool of purification and peace. Like crucifixions, witch burnings, or Premier League football. Goal! It's soccer. It's soccer. It should be called soccer. It's not a coincidence that Dionysus isn't just a divine patron of women and the poor, artists and poets, outlaws and slaves, basically everyone except Mark Zuckerberg. He's also the god that fills them with a raving madness that tips the scales of power on its head, causing them to attack anyone who gets in their way with inhuman savagery, eventually even consuming their own children.
Baby! It's what's for dinner!
All of this suggests that there exists a primitive mechanism that lies dormant within each of our minds that allows us to release ourselves from our individuality and our inhibitions, which we can sometimes catch a glimpse of during drum circles, flash mobs, and Black Friday sales, but given the right circumstances, can reduce us to an animalistic state, a pack of wild apes willing to commit atrocities we would never dream we were capable of. And the tragic irony revealed in the Bacchae is that the more you try to stifle or control this call of the wild, the more deeply you fall under its spell. It could be why Adolf Hitler, like Pentheus, his mother, and her sisters, in trying to eradicate what his raving, methamphetamine-addled mind targeted as the cause of disorder and confusion threatening his society, himself became the god's agent of chaos and destruction. In hindsight, it's clear to see what Nietzsche had missed about Dionysus in his time, blinded as he had been by the promise of spiritual and creative liberation, and also blinded by the syphilis he probably caught at a whorehouse when he was in college.
That, of course, poses the question of what was it about? But it has something to do with living.